And so it says that's a part of the new covenant. Hebrews chapter 8 talks about the new covenant. It was prophesied back in Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36. God talked about this new covenant that was going to come as a part of him dealing with humanity. And so to the Israelites, the tithe was a demonstration of obedience. So when a Hebrew or Israelite paid their tithe, all they were doing was saying, we're going to obey God. We're just going to obey God. That's why in Malachi he says, well, will a man rob God? And they said, God said, yep. They said, what do you mean? Wherein have we robbed you? And then God says very plainly, you have robbed me in tithes and offering, meaning that you've not been obedient to me. And he goes on and explains, as you go down the book of Malachi, about the curses that's going to be upon those that use his tithe for their own purposes. And talks about, in Proverbs says it's a snare to a man that used God's tithe and then asks question later. And Deuteronomy 14 explains that all these blessings are going to come upon you if you obey me in these things. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse number 28, Deuteronomy 28:50, he says, but if you don't listen to me and all these blessings I pronounce upon you, if you don't listen and do what I tell you to do, then all these curses are going to come upon you. And so now in Exodus chapter 35, you also have in the Bible free will offering. Free will offerings were to demonstrate your love for God. They would demonstrate love, joy, and worship. Like in Exodus 35, for example. Now, in Exodus 35, what is happening here, what has happened, God has tasked Moses to build a tabernacle for the people of God to come and worship him, for the priest to minister and meet with him, and to bring the people before God. And but in Exodus 35 now, it says in verse 30, let's see, you go through the whole chapter. He tells people to bring an offering. He said in Exodus 35, down to verse number 4, got all the congregation together. In verse 4, he said, then Moses spake unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, this is the thing which the Lord commanded. Notice what God commanded. Take ye from among you an offering unto the Lord. Whosoever is of a willing heart, let him bring in an offering of the Lord, gold and silver and brass. And so God commands Moses, tell the nation of Israel, tell the children of Israel that I want them to bring me an offering. This offering is a voluntary offering. Notice, it says, those whosoever is of a willing heart. So, do you have to give this offering? Not really. It says, whosoever has a willing heart. It's a voluntary offering. But it was an offering for, listen, it was an offering to be able to build the tabernacle of God. Now, what child of God don't want to be involved in God's work? Well, there are a lot of them that don't, and a lot of them that are not. But the point is, this is an offering that you did not have to give to. He says, whosoever is of a willing heart. So if you decide you don't want to give that offering, guess what? You don't have to give to it. Like when we ask for an offering for building bathrooms, or offering for repairing the building, or offering for fixing the vans, if you don't want to give to them, guess what? You don't have to give to them. All right? But the point is, that's not the tithe. That's a different way of giving. This is a voluntary offering. And so, but the Bible does say this. In 2 Corinthians 9, it says, those that give sparingly, you shall also reap sparingly. Those who give bountifully, you shall also reap bountifully. Now, so it's a voluntary, it's a free will offering, and you find throughout the book of Exodus 35 and 36, this offering was one for those who had a willing spirit. Look in verse 21. And they came, everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whom his spirit made willing. Again in verse 22, it says, and they came, both men and women, as many as were willing-hearted. And then they brought all this stuff. Again in verse 29, the children of Israel brought a willing offering unto the Lord. All right? So what's the point that's being made here? So what's the point that's being made in Exodus 35 about this offering for the tabernacle? What's the point? It was voluntary. It was a willing heart. And then again, in verse, then when you get to chapter 6, it says they bought so much stuff, and then Moses told the people, don't bring any more stuff. You brought too much stuff. We don't need any more stuff. We got enough. We got sufficient. It says, look in Exodus 36. Now, Bezalel and Aholiab, these are wise-hearted men. These are men that God himself had put wisdom and understanding in their hearts. So they know all kinds of carpentry and all kind of masonry work. They tectons. They know technical during that day. Like Jesus Christ was a tecton. You know what a tecton is? A tecton, it says, when you look at the word, what do we, they often call Jesus, they say Joseph is the son of a what? Carpenter. Well, if you look that word up in your Bible and look at them in a Greek dictionary or lexicon, whatever, you'll find that word carpenter is the word tecton. A tecton was not somebody just built stuff out of wood, because in Jesus' day, they didn't build houses out of wood. What did they build houses out of? Stone. They had to be able to cut stone and carve stone and cut rock. You go back in ancient Israel, they didn't build houses out of wood and lumber and like this floor. They had some of this stuff, but that's not how they built their houses. They built them out of stone and out of bricks. And so the word carpenter doesn't mean that Jesus was a carpenter like Brother Rotten Ray is a carpenter. He put this stage in here. It doesn't mean a carpenter like that. It means somebody that was skilled in all kinds of work. He could know how to measure out the dimensions to build a house. He knew how to cut the blocks to build a house. He had some blocks were small size. He knew how to cut the doorways. Some blocks were huge. And so they would have to put on the roof or thatch and all that. So he was trained and learned not in just how to be a carpenter from the standpoint of putting in a door or putting in a wood frame perhaps. He also knew how to use stone and all the weaponry, all the instruments of masonry and whatever the technical ability. He was like the word literally means he's like an architect. He was to the degree where he could design a house and then he could build a house. You understand what I'm saying? That's what Jesus. So when you hear that Jesus was a carpenter, we think of, like in our American thinking process, we think of a carpenter like somebody that goes out and build a wood house or build a frames up a house. Now, isn't that what we think of? No, yes, I know it is. That's what we normally think of a carpenter. But he was more than a carpenter. He was a tecton. He was the one that had architectural design. He could design a house, and then he could build a house. He could do the architectural drawing for the house, and then he could build the house. And so that's what Jesus was. But now the Israelites, they tied because God told them to. Look with me in Exodus 25. Hey, Brother Muhammad. Exodus 25, verse number 2. Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart. You shall take my offering. So the Israelites, they took this offering because God told them to. They gave above and beyond the tithe because they wanted to. Exodus 35 and verse 4 and 5, we already saw that. 35:21, 35:22, we already looked at all those. And so they had a willing heart. They wanted to give. So the tithe, because God told them, he said, bring you all the tithe to the storehouse. But the offerings, now these voluntary offerings, they did that because they wanted to. All right, so they had a willing heart. And we already looked at Exodus 35. Now, in the life of the Israelites, there was not just one tithe. They had three. Look at Numbers chapter 18. That's where I told you to turn at the very beginning. Look at Numbers 18. Numbers 18 in verse number 21. It says, and behold, I have given the children of Levi all the what? 10th in Israel. So the Levites got all the tithes in Israel for an inheritance. For what purpose? Look at Leviticus, Numbers 18:21. For what? For their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. And so this tithe supported the priests and the Levites that did the service in the tabernacle. Now, this is Old Testament theology, Old Testament economy, but the tithe was an important part of maintaining the work of the tabernacle. It was important for maintaining the work of God. It was important to support the priests and the Levites. And notice again, and behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance for their service, which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. And so the only one that really could minister in the tabernacle were those who were the tribe of Levi. If you were one of the other 11 tribes and went up to the tabernacle trying to do the work and service of the ministry, God would kill you. You would die. All right? And so that's why Aaron and his sons were anointed by God. Of course, Moses did the anointing. God told Moses, anoint Aaron and his sons with this. And there was a special mixture of some kind of ointment and fragrance they put together. It was called a holy ointment or whatever. And it was not to be used for anything else except for anointing the priests and the Levites that were going to do the service of God. He said, but the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. I'm in verse 23 of Numbers 18. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance. But the tithe of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord. Anybody know what a heave offering is? What, somebody tell me, guess about it, guess. I'll find out. What is a heave offering? Anybody know what a heave offering is? That basically you lift it to the Lord. It's a heave offering. And basically what you're saying is kind of like you have like a wave offering, a heave offering that you're lifting up to the Lord, saying, Lord, thank you for this harvest. Thank you for this crop. Thank you for this wheat. Thank you for this barley. Thank you for this fruit that you're giving me. I'm lifting it up to you. I'm dedicating the first part of it to you. It's a heave offering, a wave offering. And I want you to think it's a portion of an offering that was raised up to God. It was dedicated to God, saying, God, thank you for giving me this. I know that there's more to come after this. And it says, so with the tithe of the children of Israel, verse 24, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I said unto them, among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. So he gave them the tithe, and they would wave a part of that to the Lord for an offering. Notice again, look at verse 25. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, thus speak unto the Levites now, and say unto them. Now he's already told the whole congregation, listen, when you bring your tithe and offering, all of that tithe and offering is going to go to the Levites. And he says, so you need to know that they're working in this tabernacle, they're serving the Lord, and that's what this is for. And then he said, now, Levites, this is what you're to do. He says, when you take of the children of Israel the tithe, which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up an heave offering of it for the Lord. Notice how much they had to offer up. A tenth part of the tithe. Do you see? All of this is teaching about the tithe that you may know about, you may never hear about. But when the Levites got their tenth of all the tithe and offering that came in from the 11 tribes of Israel, they also had to take a tenth of that and give it to God. So nobody was left out. Everybody participated in paying tithe and offering. The 11 tribes, the Levites that ministered in the tabernacle. And so that was God's plan. And though you may not believe so, you may not agree with God, it is still God's plan today for all of his people to be involved in taking care of the work of God, taking care of the house of God. You see, it's not just the 20% that take care of the work of God in the house of God. It should be 100%. That's what God honors. That's what God blesses. And that's why when you get to the book of Chronicles and you look at the book of Exodus, where they had more stuff than they could handle, that the people of God, that the house of God in Moses' day and in the King Hezekiah's day, they had more than what they needed to do the work of God. They had some left over. They had heaps left over, so that when people came and said, Hampton Roads, can you help us to pay our utility bill this month? Because we fell short. I lost my job. I broke my anchor. I didn't work. And all these things. We can say, yes, we can. Because not only do we have enough to take care of us, now we have something to take care of other people. That was part of the purpose for the tithe and offering. See, the Israelites did not have a state government welfare system. Their widows and their fatherless and their orphan and their homeless were taken care of by the people of God, by the communities in which they live. In Israel now, they have these kibbutzes. They have these two kind of different type communities. They have these communities, I forget, they call it, I think they call it the kibbutz. And what happens in those kibbutz, everybody in that kibbutz, in that community, I think it's the right word, everybody in that community, if you have a skill, say you're a carpenter, or you're a workman, or you grow crops, you have to provide something in that community to stay in that community. If you hurt yourself or you can't work, and then that community takes care of all of your needs. If you're a man and you can't work for a period of time, 6 months a year, they make sure that you're taken care of, your family's taken care of, your children are taken care of, your kids make sure your kids go to school, everything you need to live sufficiently so that when you're in a position where you can't take care of yourself, that community takes care of you. Now, once you get back to the point where you can provide the community, you start providing back for that community. Now, anybody in that kibbutz that doesn't provide some means of support for that community kicks them out. They can't stay there. That's how Israel works today. Okay, they can't stay there. See, if you got a lazy young person, a lazy man that won't work, won't provide for his family, they kick him out. They kick his family out. They have to have some other means because they're not going to take care of you when you have a means to take care of yourself and you're not providing anything for that kibbutz. You understand? So nobody, now you got these other kind of communities, they're different. But those communities called the kibbutz, that only people that live in those communities are those who help provide to make sure that community prospers. They have their own, they have doctors in there, they have lawyers in there, they have a fruit growers in there, they have all the needs of that community that they would get from the outside of the community are met within that kibbutz. All right, and so you have them all over the nation of Israel, and of course, then you have another type where I think they just everybody work for themselves and provide like that. But in the kibbutz, I think that then they got the tails. Okay, you got the kibbutz and then you got the tails. That's different. Tails like tail Dan, they're different. But anyway, that's how it works. Well, that's how it was in God's economy, and so that's why He says, now for you Levites, I want you to take a 10th part of the tithe. Now, so if I tithe off $100, how much is that? $10. I give it to Brother Tony Greer. He's a Levite. Brother Tony Greer get that $10 from me, and then what are you supposed to do with that $10? You're supposed to give 10% of that $10 to the Lord, back for the work of God. And that's exactly. So now you don't have $100, you have $10. So what is 10% of $10? You got to give $1 of that back to God's work, to God. That's how this system works. And listen, because it was a system designed by God, when God's people worked it, guess what happened? Everybody had what they needed. Think about it. Because God designed a system that works. The only problem that we have with God's systems and God's programs, or he don't call them programs, but with God's orders, is that we just have, because we're sinners, and we believe, like Jacob, that we can outthink God, we can out-scheme God, and we have a better plan than God, so we come up with a different idea about how to do this and how it's going to work better. I try to get folks to stay in the house of God, serve God, honor God, and then you'll find out that you fare a whole lot better when you honor God with what God provides for you. And instead of working 3 jobs to be able to make ends meet, God can provide for you to work 1 job and have ends meeting and have some things left over. But our thinking is that, well, no, if I do this, I can do this a little bit more here, a little bit more here, a little bit more, I get a little more here, a little bit more, and you get more hours, more this, more hours, more. Listen, and we work ourselves into a frenzy, and we still find ourselves frustrated because you're just going around what God has said. This is how I provide for my people. He told Jacob, he blessed Jacob, I'm going to provide for you, but you're going to have the blessing. But Jacob schemed and lied. And listen, for 20 years, he was out of fellowship of God, running from Esau, scared to death. God had to bring him to a point where God got him by himself. You know why we don't like to be by ourselves sometimes? Because when we were isolated and we were alone and we were in solitude, we have to look God in the face, and then we have to look ourselves in the face. And we don't like what we see. See, most of Americans don't like solitude. You find when people are, most of the time, everybody you see when they're out, they're like this. You watch. You watch. Even in church, you watch. And now, when people go home, they don't like to sit in the house by themselves. You know what they do? Turn on all the lights, turn on the TV, and just listen. Because when God brings us to a point where there's a quietness in our soul, we have to start thinking about who we really are and who God really is. And when we start looking at who God is and comparing ourselves to God, we find out that we're not as good as we think we are. And then we say, well, let me get my mind on something else. Solitude brings us to a point where we have to face ourselves. That's what God had to do with Jacob. He brought him to a place where he was at the ford of Jabbok. And he said, and Jacob was alone. He had already schemed all this stuff out, how to protect his children, his family, and all this stuff. Listen, you read the story, what is Exodus, I think Genesis 32, and he was scared of Esau. Esau was coming and had 400 men, and Jacob was scared to death. He sent some message and said, hey, tell my Lord Esau, calling Esau his Lord and everything. Now, that was just flattery. I mean, he had already tricked him and everything and lied to his father, lied to Esau. And so now he said, he had all these things. God had blessed Jacob. And he had 2 bands of families and children and Rachel and all this stuff. And all he had, he sent 580 animals up to Esau to kind of appease Esau's anger and stuff like that. And then he did all that first. He strategized, he flattered, he strategized. And then you know what he did last? Like we do. Then he prayed. See, he made all this plan, and then he prayed. He should have prayed before he made the plan. But we do the same. Listen, we do the same thing. We make all these plans, and then we pray. What we need to do is pray and let God give us the plan. And so, but we don't do that sometimes. And listen, I've experienced in my own life. Every Christian have experienced in their lives. And that's why God put that story in the Bible, so that, because Jacob was one that had learned to depend upon his own wisdom and his own scheming and his own cunning and his own cleverness to try to get what God had already promised him. And so we don't have to do that. God has already promised us eternal life. He's already promised us abundant life. We simply have to obey God to see that come to fruition. Because listen, when God saved us, he told us, this is what I already have for you. This is your inheritance already. You don't have to do anything to get it, but obey me. And so that was what Jacob didn't do. God had to teach him to do that. And, you know, the way God taught him to do that, like I heard a man say one time, listen, God will protect you, but God does not pamper us. You know what I'm saying? You may not understand what I mean, but see, God will protect you because he has something for us to do. But he's not going to pamper you. That's why when Jacob was having all these trouble, you know who was bringing the trouble into Jacob's life? God. You know why? Because he wanted Jacob to face who he really was. And so that's why he got to a point and said, what's your name? What is your name, Jacob? You lied to your father about 5 times. Your mother boosts you up to scheme and lie some more. You got your brother's birthright, which God already promised you in the first place. You didn't have to scheme to get it. Now you're running. You stay with your uncle Laban. Laban was his uncle. Laban was just as crooked as he was. And Laban deceived him, and he deceiving his dad and his brother, and then he goes to stay with his uncle named Laban, and Laban deceived him for 20 years. He wants to marry Rachel, and he gives him Leah first because she's the oldest, has to stay another few years, 7, 8 years to be able to get Rachel before he can leave. And so for 20 years, he stays with Laban, and eventually he gets to leave there, and he said, thank God. And then Laban said, you can't leave. And so God, you know what God told Laban about Jacob? He said, leave him alone. He said, this is what he says. Don't help him. Just don't hurt him. Basically saying this, just let him go. He said, don't do it. He said, don't do anything to hurt him. Don't do anything to help him. And see, sometime in our lives, that's what God tells us. When it comes to people that won't obey God, God says, just leave them alone. Don't help them. Don't hurt them. And so now, I want to give you a lesson that I learned. A lot of times when people are like that, God says, I want you to leave them alone. I don't want you to help them, but I don't want you to hurt them. What God is trying to do is to teach them what they won't learn if we try to help them. See, a lot of times folks get themselves in a situation and we run to the rescue trying to help them out of the situation. But what happened in that is part of the judgment that God's pouring upon them comes upon us. He says, he told Laban about Jacob. He said, listen, don't help him, but don't hurt him. Let me handle him. And that's what happened with Jacob. God brought him to a point where now Laban wasn't trying to hurt him. Nobody was trying to help him. And now he's by himself. He said, oh my goodness, I'm scared to death. I'm out here in the wilderness, been out of fellowship with God for 20 years, and I ain't have anybody to turn to, and I'm all by myself. What am I going to do? And that's when God says, now, are you ready to listen to what I got for you? The blessing I told you you're going to have. And so you know the story, I think. You go through, you read it, where he ended up wrestling with an angel all night long, and he said, and you know what? And then I should have preached that more, but you know what he said? The angel said, let me go. You know what Jacob said? No, I will not let you go. Basically, that's what God wants to say about him. Listen, hold on. Don't let me go, because I got something for you. All right, numbers. All right, so one tribe supported the priests and the Levites. So that's Numbers 18. Everybody there? Oh, wow, it's time to stop. Now, another tribe was provided for the sacred festivals of Israel. Look in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse number 17. Deuteronomy 12, verse number 17. Man, there's a lot of lessons, a lot of principles in the Old Testament that pertain to our lifestyle in the 21st century right now. In Deuteronomy chapter number 12, look in verse 17 and 18. Now, we're talking about tithes and offering, God's principle of financing God's work, some things that you know, some things that you don't know, some things that we've heard before, some things that we need to apply to life. But in Deuteronomy 12, in verse 17, he says this. Thou mayest not eat within thy gates the tithe of thy corn. Notice, you can't eat of the tithe of the corn. Now, in verse 5 and 6, he tells them, I want you to bring all this stuff in. He said, I'm going to tell you to bring it to a place that I'm going to choose. Let's go back to verse 5. But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and thither shalt thou come. And thither ye shall bring your, notice, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, and your what? Tithe. Deuteronomy 12:6. Heave offerings of your hand, and your vows, and your free will offering, and the firstling of your herds and of your flock. Those free will offering were those that you don't have to give to these offerings. They're voluntary offerings. You volunteer to give them. You don't have to give them. Then it says this in verse number 12, 17. Thou mayest not eat. Then talk about all these offerings. Look one more time. Look at verse 14. Let's go back. I keep going back. It says, but in the place which the Lord shall choose in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer the burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee. All right. Then he goes down and says, verse 16, 17. He says, that God, he has given thee the unclean, talk about the beasts and stuff like that, what you can eat, the deer, the roebuck. He said, thou mayest not eat within thy gates the tithe of thy corn, or that is the tithe of thy wine, or the tithe of thy oil, or the tithe of the firstling of the herds of thy flock, nor any of thy vows which thou vowest, nor thy free will offering or heave offering of thine hand. But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Thou and thy son and thy daughter and thy manservant and thy maidservant and the Levite that is within thy gates, and thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. Take heed to yourselves that thou forsake not the Levite as long as thou livest upon the earth. He said, as long as the Levites, long as you live on earth, don't forsake the Levite. Why didn't God want the nation of Israel to forsake the Levites? What good were the Levites? Right, in the tabernacle, they were God's portion. They were God's inheritance. The Levites were a special people. They out of the 12 tribes. God says, if you go back in the book of Exodus, you find that God's plan was for the firstborn out of every tribe to be a priest to God, to work in the tabernacle. But because of their sin and disobedience, God said, all right, I'm just going to choose out of the 12 tribes, I'm going to just use one tribe to do service for me. They're going to be my portion. They're not going to have an inheritance in the land because I'm going to be their inheritance. I'm going to take care of them, and I'm going to set up a system to make sure they're taken care of. And so the Levites, again, Deuteronomy 14:23, again, it talks about this tithe. It said that there's a bring in the place of God, it said to bring. Now, then look in Deuteronomy 14, look at verse 28 and 29. Picking up in verse number 27. It says, and the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he has no part nor inheritance with thee. Notice, at the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase that same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. And the Levites, notice, because he has no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. See, associated with taking care of the fatherless, the strangers, and the widows, and the Levites, God says, I will bless all the work of your hand which you doest. What he's saying is this: you do what I tell you to do. And honor me with tithe and offering. This tithe on the 3rd year, it supported the orphans, the fathers, it supported widows, it supported those who were poor. And so you go back to, again, you go to Deuteronomy 26 and verse 12, and you see it again. So the first, look at Deuteronomy 26, and I'm going to stop here. I got it, let me see, 1, 2, 3. We need to get to the New Testament. We won't do that today. But look in Deuteronomy 26, verse 12 and 13. When thou hast made an end of tithing, notice, all the tithes of thine increase, the 3rd year, which is the year of tithing, and hast given it unto the Levites, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat within thy gates and be filled. Then thou shalt say before the Lord thy God, I have brought away the hallowed things out of mine house, and also have given them unto the Levites, and to the strangers, the father, and to the widow, according to all thy commandments, which thou hast commanded me. I have not transgressed thy commandments, neither have I forgotten them. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning, neither have I taken away aught thereof for any unclean use, nor given aught therefore for the dead. But I have hearkened to the voice of the Lord my God, and have done according to all that thou hast commanded me. Look down from thy holy habitation from heaven, and bless thy people Israel, and the land which thou hast given us, as thou swearest unto our fathers, a land that flows with milk and honey. This day the Lord thy God has commanded thee to do these statutes and judgment. Thou shalt therefore keep and do them with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Now, the first and most basic tithe was for what purpose? Somebody tell me, what were the first and most basic reason for the tithe being paid to God by God's people? We just read in Leviticus, read in Deuteronomy, read it in Numbers. Well, the question is this. Exactly. What were the first and the most basic purpose for the tithe being given by God's people? To honor God, to support the ministry. It was for, what we read in Numbers chapter 18, what we read there? What did Levites do with that tithe? Clarence mentioned about worship God, taking care of the Levites. The first and the most basic purpose for the tithe being given by God's people was to take care of the people that took care of the work of God. It was to take care of the house of God. It was to take care of the tabernacle. It was to take care of the service that was being performed by the Levites in the house of God. That's the first and most basic reason that the tithe is given. It deals with taking care of the work of God. That's what the Levites were selected for. They were selected by God to take care of the tabernacle and the house of God before the congregation. So when the tithe is given, it's not given just so we can pay bills, though it is, because that's part of taking care of the work of God. But it was given to take care of the worship and the services of God, because the tabernacle was a place that represented the presence of God. And God's people were to give to support that tabernacle. And the people that worked in the tabernacle were who? The priests, the Levites primarily, that worked in there. And so that's the most basic reason for the tithe, was religious purposes. And specifically it was to support the leaders, the Levites. So what happened with that, it freed the Levites from having to provide for themselves while they were trying to do the service of God in the tabernacle. They could not get out and work in the fields and bring in the crops in the barley fields and wheat fields like the other tribes could, because they were busy, and the work of the house of God kept them as busy. They worked 8-12 hours a day in the tabernacle, just like the people work 8-12 hours out in the field. As a matter of fact, they had to make sure that the light in the lamp in the tabernacle never went out. So that means somebody had to be there 24/7 to make sure that light. It says when the tabernacle was completed, it said that God lit the fire on the altar from heaven. And he says, and that fire is to never go out. The Levites were responsible to make sure that fire in the tabernacle never went out. In Eli's day, guess what? Before Samuel came along, that fire was just about to go out, because the priests and the Levites had not been taken care of, and the work of God had not been taken care of. And so the house of God was laying away. Brother Maurice? Right. I know he wasn't a Levite. He had some wicked sons too. And they called the people of God to abhor the work of God. And of course you get people like that too. They call people to abhor the work of God. Now, and so providing the resources necessary to do their job. And so you go into Numbers chapter 3, Numbers chapter 8, Numbers chapter 18. Now, if a believer does not learn the discipline of tithing, he will never discover the joy of voluntary giving. And that's the reality, that so many people don't learn the joy of being able to give voluntarily to the work of God, because they have first not gotten a hold of the idea, the concept of tithing. And so I'm going to stop here for the day, and we'll look at something else next week. Next week, we're looking at the tithing for the Christian, the training wheels of learning to give to God. It's the first step of good stewardship of God's possession which he has entrusted to us. 1 Corinthians 4:7 says this. Look in 1 Corinthians 4:7. I'm going to read this one scripture, and we're going to close down with that. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. And then next week, I'm on page 7 of my 26 page of notes. I'm on page 7. I got 26 pages of notes that's on tithe and offering. And that doesn't even include, well, I think it does. A few pages include tithing in the New Testament. Let's see what we got. Yeah, let's see. Tithing in the New Testament. Tithing. The precedent. The purpose of tithing. Oh, the benefits of tithing. The tithe and the Levites. The function of the Levites. Oh yeah, God's word teaches us that we are to tithe, but it also teaches us how to tithe. Okay. 1 Corinthians 4:7. Notice what it says. Everybody there? Read it for yourself and see what it says. And I'll read it out. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory or boast as if thou hast not received it? Basically, Paul is telling the Corinthians, listen, don't be bragging and boasting about what you have, what you don't have, because everything that you have, it was given to you. You have received it from somebody, from somewhere. How do you, when you come into the world, what do you come into the world with? When you go out of the world, what do you go out with? That's what the Bible tells us. When we come into the world, we come with nothing. It says, and it's certain that when you leave the world, you're going to leave with nothing. Now, that's the truth. And so if you come into the world, anything that I have now, I have received it. And so I can't be boasting about it as if I've done some great work to get it. Somebody gave it to me. I received it from some source. And sure, we work. But never forget, who gives me the ability to stand up here right now and teach and preach the things of God? God. You know, God. Every day at the VA Medical Center, this is the last thing they say in their meeting. Who brought us here today? They say, God. And they say, God, grant us the sincerity, wisdom to, what are the things about the wisdom to know the difference between the thing that we can change, the thing we can't change, and the courage to change the thing we can't change, the wisdom to know the difference. And then it says, all right, it works if we work it, it don't if it don't. It says, so work it and live. Because if you don't work it, you're going to die. That's the bottom line. It says, work it. If you work it, it works. And if you don't, it don't. If you work it, it works. And if you don't, it won't. So work it and live. It's the same thing go for tithe and offering. It works if you work it, and it won't if you don't. So work it and live. Because if you don't, one day you're going to die, and you're going to give an account to the one that brought you here, and that's God. And I like that every morning at the meetings, we have community meetings every morning from 8 to 9, have two meetings, one with the substance use abuse, and then the one with the mental. They call the mental ward, mental patient. They call them the smart people. Somebody say, the guy that had the meeting. He's an Air Force veteran. He said, yeah, they call us the smart people. Now these are the mentally. They have PTSD. They got a lot of mental issues. So they it's called DCM, dorm case management. A lot of them deal with high risk and stuff. But a lot of them have they're mentally challenged, not because they were unintelligent, because of drugs and then the mental stability. You know, they lost some of their mental stability, and just a lot goes on, stuff like that. And so they said they call that the smart group. But every day they say, who brought us here today? God. And now some of them don't even believe in God. But they all say, who brought us here today? Everybody says, God. All right. And it's all right, have a good day. Meeting adjourned. And they come back and do it again the next day. And so, anyway, let's close. Anybody got any questions, comments about tithe and offering? About we're gonna now. I'm teaching, and we're looking at